Lesson C3, KPI creation in detail. Topic 2, KPIs from time series data.
The lesson objective here is to understand the KPI options from time series sources or data tags. So we'll use our example KPIs again, and this time we're going to go through the ones that are from time series data. Now there's a lot of configuration options from these, and my objective here is not to go through everyone in detail, but to show you the principles and to give you enough information to start playing with them yourself. Let's look at the first of these, which is the number. Here we can see it's a data tag, and we at the moment have just a simple value. So let's pop in something from our basket that might be a little bit more interesting. You can see straight away now it's 23 instead of 1024, but we might want a bit more detail, so we can add some decimal places. So there's one of the first configuration options. You can set the accuracy of it. Then we have options to set the size of the KPI and the text size. So if we set this to a smaller number here, say half, you can see the text gets much smaller. Let's set the size of the KPI itself bigger. That has no effect on the number, but if we do that on the sparkline, that will drive it much bigger because that has a graphic element to it. So the size controls really only work on elements with a graphical representation. The size of the number is driven by the text. We'll set that back to 72. We then have other options to add a title. Now the title here you can see is just above the number. If I delete it, it disappears. One option you might want to do is to add a row and put the titles in the row as text instead of having them on each KPI. And when you come to make tables of KPIs, there is an option within the settings to make the first row headings, and that will make everything bold in the first row. So that would generally only be done if you're using text KPIs in the top row. Not too many other options on the number. A couple of things worth talking about here though are the time span and the stale after time. The time span sets the length of time, the trend window, if you click on the value to trend it. So 7 days or 1 week is a pretty good starting point. So if I save that and go out of edit mode, if I now click on this to trend it, you'll see that my trend goes back 7 days from the 2nd of July all the way up to the 9th of July. So that's a useful configuration because some things you may want to trend 90 days, say the quarter. And the other thing is the stale after time. Some values might update very frequently, like 60 seconds, and if you don't get a new value after a minute, you might want to know about it. So if I put this at some silly number, like 1 second, I see a stale indicator. This is the indicator that says that the value has gone stale. We suspect something's wrong with it because it is not updated within the time we'd expect. That 1 second is obviously unrealistic, but you might want to put it at, say, 10 minutes, which is 600 seconds. And that way you can get a useful indication when you look at a dashboard to know something's not quite right with the underlying data. The next step on from the number is the number with a sparkline. So here, instead of just showing the value, we're going to show a sparkline. And then we have the option to show the value. If I untick this, you'll see that the numbers disappeared from our sparkline. We also can show the thousands separator, which makes it a little bit easier to read. We've got the same options for stale after. We have an option here to show the statistics. So this will show the maximum and the minimum within the range. Then the time span, we can change that to be, say, 28 days. Let's say it's 4 weeks. And that way, this sparkline then will be for that period, and there'll be a little indicator at the left-hand side to show how long it's for. We've then got the scale, so we have a minimum and a maximum, or we can choose to auto scale. the value. So currently our value is 2,200-ish. So our maximum of 1,500 is not going to be high enough. So if we were to reset that to something like 2,500 and take off auto scale, then we fix the level and fix the scale that it's at. Most KPIs have an option to add additional trends. In the case of a sparkline, we can add a minimum and a maximum. I'll just drag some in here from the basket that I've made. I'm going to say this is the low limit. We'll give this a colour, and I'll also add in a high limit there. Give that the same colour. So now our sparkline has limits on it as well, and these show up if you click it to trend it. You get the limits added to the trend as well. We have options to change the colour, so we can change the colour of the line or the text foreground. If we change this to blue, and we see we've got a blue line, we can change the background colour of the line here. That might be useful, especially if you're in a free placement mode and you're overlaying it on a graphic and you need to set a background colour so it's more visible. There, now we've got a little grey background. I'm going to take that off though. Then the last options are similar to what we've seen before with the number, and we can change the height and the width, the KPI, we can change the text size. Padding won't affect anything really on sparkline. Decimal places, we can set some kind of precision to this if we want to as well. Okay, that covers the sparkline. The other option we can do with a data tag is to show the timestamp instead of the value itself. So here, as before, we've got a data tag, but we're going to display the update time instead of the value. Less options here. Again, in this case, clicking it to trend it will trend the value itself. Clicking the update time, there's nothing to trend. And we have fewer options. We just have the text color, the background color, and the text size. But useful if you want to show when a value was last updated. The next KPI we'll look at is the level component. So here's a level. As before, we have a data tag, and this time we're going to pick the level option. Pretty similar to the other components, we can set a time span for when the trend opens. We have the ability to customize what if the value is shown or not. If it uses 1,000 separator, we can alter the decimal places if there are any. We can change the height and the width, the orientation. We can be horizontal or vertical. Again, I think the interesting thing here is to look at the additional trends. So here, let's drag in something. Here we have an option of having it stacked as an additional value or a reference value as a line or a box. So let's look at these in turn. If we choose stacked value, save it, then the reference value is put on top of the value we looked at. And here we can see that the numbers have become too wide now. So what we need to add then is a width. Let's give it a width of maybe 100. Still not wide enough. Let's make it 150 then. So then we've got a wide level and we've stacked the value. Now we put the maximum here at 2,000, but we've added a value of 2,000 to 1,234. So we're already at 3,200 plus. So that's why it's gone over the maximum. If we increase the maximum to 3,500, that will bring the level gauge back down to within the limits of what we put. The alternative that we could have rather than a stacked value is an additional value. And here it will plot the two side by side within the level component. So in this case, you can see that the text size is really too big. So we need to bring this down if it's going to be visible. So here we can make like a mini bar graph with multiple different series together. So this is how you can start to build up more complex looking components from simple ones. Right, instead of an additional value, let's look at having a reference value as a line. So now we have a line across our level gauge showing this particular reference value. And the final one is a box. And this will draw a dotted line around where your reference is. We've done this actually on this one. This is a neater version of it actually, but exactly the same configuration. We have an additional value set as a box. We've just tweaked the colours and the max value more accurately. And then here we have one that's done horizontally. So the level component, lots of options to do.
Next, we'll look at the status indicators.
So here we've got some examples. We've got a status light with a number, we've got a flashing icon, and we've got text. So let's take a look. So to show a status component, we pick status from the display option. Again, we have the option to show the value, show separators, use the timestamp value instead, and we can configure the time span for when the trend opens. And then we have the options for what to display as the status. Here we've got a number, so it's going to be driven by the number, and we've got several options to show a circle, some text, or an icon. The icons, by default, there is 4 different icons, but we can add more as part of your installation if you have certain icons that you'd like to see. Go back to circle. Then we can set the color. There's the default palette, and again, as with any color picker, you can set a custom hex color if you like, and there's the option to make it flash or not. Then we have the conditions. So there's 3 statuses that are pre-configured. There's bad, okay, and other. You can use them however you want. You've essentially got 2 conditions, and then if it's not one of those, what else should it be? So here we're saying if it's below 1,000, then it should be red. If it's greater than or equal to 1,000, it should be green. Otherwise, it should be yellow. We could have had a mid-range there. So we could have had, say, if it's less than 1,000, it's red. If it's greater than 2,000, it's green. Otherwise, it's yellow. So I've changed that one to flash. In fact, let's say that it's got to be greater than 2,000. There, and now you can see that it's using the other status to drive it. So here we've got the flashing icon, and this one you can see we've chosen the valve icon, and we've set the criteria, and we've set the orientation of it as well, and we have another status as well. Then we've got the other controls as usual: the width, the height, the text size, and you can set the foreground and the background color. That's for if the number is visible. And finally, we have the text option. So instead of showing a picture, a circle, or an icon, we're going to use text, okay and not okay, and you can type what you like there.
The final KPI to look at is arrows.
So dials and gauges have a fair amount in common, but we will look at them separately because you would use them in different situations. A dial, we pick the dial from the display, and again we have the options we're familiar with now about showing the value or not, using the 1,000 separator, and setting the time span. Min and max as before. What's worth noting then is the inner radius ratio and the bit about additional trends. The inner radius gives you the thickness of the overall radius that we'll use. So here at the moment we've got this set to 0.6. So let's have a look at the impact of reducing this to, say, 0.1. And there we are. We can see that it becomes a very, very fat dial. But let's go the other way and reduce it to 0.9. And we have a very thin dial. So 0.6 is the default, and it looks pretty good. But let's choose 0.8 and make a thin one. And then let's use the background color. Let's set it to a light gray. So here's quite a nice way where you can make an easy on the eye dial. It gets filled up with the blue, that represents the value, and then you've got the grey showing you where the rest of the ring is. Now, additional trends let you, much like the level component, add values that can be displayed as either a stacked value, an additional value, or reference values as a line box. with a stacked value, it does what it says, it adds it onto the value that's there. So let's try that now. We've taken 2000 and added it as a stacked value. That means we need to change our maximum to 3,500 there. So let's just take a quick look at that. There we are. We've got our blue is the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we've added 2000 as a stacked value. But the number in the middle is only showing the value of the data tag. If we want the value in the middle to show the total of the stack, then we tick the sum box there and we can click save. Now the total in the middle shows the total across all stacked values, and that's the same in the level component as well, and anywhere where you see a stacked value. Here we have a dial again with multiple series, but this time we've put them as additional series. So if we go in, we can see that the additional trends have been added as additional values. Now we have this here, this box, a multiplier. So there are some instances when a tag that you want to bring in needs to be scaled in order to match. For example, you might have something in 1000 meters cubed and you want to add it to something that's just in meters cubed. Well, you could either make a calculation or you can scale the value here, which can be very useful. So for example, if we multiplied this one by 10, then it gets 10 times bigger. Set that back to 1. Then we've just got the color controls at the bottom here. We've got the foreground and the background color. The additional trends obviously are set independently. So let's set the background color to something obvious that we can see. And there we have it like before. We set that one to grey, it's a bit easier on the eye. The foreground color controls the font. So we could set the font to orange. Not the best looking display I've ever made. Set that back. There. And then finally we have the reference value set as a line. So here it just places a line on the dial that shows you the reference, and you can have multiple references. So these limits around here, we could change all of these to be reference value lines, and then we get multiple different lines on our dial. Okay, that covers dials. Gauges. Similar to dials, these are circular components with a number, but they mimic an analog clock. We pick gauge from the display if we want to see them. And then again, the interesting thing here are the inner radius ratio and the number of ticks. As before, the bigger the number, the thinner the outer will be. So if we had set this to say 0.3 and save it, our ticks become much larger. Then we have the number of ticks that we want to see. If we set this to a high number, it becomes really impractical and hard to use. You can do it, but it's extremely difficult to use the gauge. So you normally want to set this to some kind of sensible number, and it's good to have it as an odd number because you have a tick at the start and a tick at the end, and then you want an even spacing in between. So if we set that back to 11, then we should get ticks roughly every 200 there. Then you have controls over the size of the number. I see this number's clipping a bit on the edge, so maybe we'll bring that down a little bit. That's better, a bit more visible. And then we have the colours, much like before. And we have the option to control the size and the text size, which we've just looked at, and the precision if we want to show decimal places. Additional values are the same as before. These can be additional values, stacked values, or reference values. If we add something as an additional value, this time it adds a second set of hands onto the dial, like here. And in this case, we've got an additional value as a reference value or a line, and it puts it as a line that sits constant. Additional values and reference values, they can all be tags. I've used constants here, but they can be time series data, other tags that vary themselves. Okay, that covers gauges.
The final KPI to look at is arrows.
Now, arrows, you select again the arrow option from the display, and The interesting options here are we have the option to what we're going to scale. So first of all, we set the orientation if we want it to point right, left, up or down. And then we pick the point that we want to be fixed. So here we're saying we want the start of the arrow to be fixed, and from the start to scale both the height and width according to the value. So we've got a value of 1234 against a maximum of 2000. So at a value of 2000, that arrow will fill completely the size that we've set for it. So that's the limits of the arrow size within this scale. Now the arrow component is a little different from the level component in that if the value goes above the maximum, it won't break the confines of its limits. So here we've doubled it and it stayed within that. Let's set it back to what it was. So here we've got a vertical arrow, and this time we've said just scale the width of the arrow. We fixed the start, but we're going to scale the width. So if we take this one down to a very small number, you can see that it becomes a really skinny arrow. And if we go up to its maximum, it becomes a fat arrow. Set that back.
So that's a fairly detailed overview of the different KPIs that can be created. I'd encourage you to have a go now, try and make something for yourself. There's another session on KPIs in Pathway 3 where we'll go into even more detail looking at how you can configure it within the code itself, how you can copy whole KPIs or just single ones, and some tips and tricks if you're doing either big KPIs or trying to replicate pages and making complicated things. It's a very powerful tool. There's lots you can do. So good luck, have a play, and we'll see you in the next lesson.